Before we begin, please like, plus subscribe to support this journey of healing, hope, and purpose. Let's walk this path together. The church bell rang solemnly in the distance as Leah stood under the gray sky, her black umbrella trembling slightly in her hand. Rain fell like tears from heaven, quiet, constant, and indifferent. The funeral had ended, but her pain had only begun. Her brother Daniel, a kind man who spent his life helping others, had died in a car accident while delivering groceries to an elderly neighbor. Leah's heart cracked with grief, but what disturbed her most was the question burning in her soul. Why does God let good people suffer? This question, I sinti, just Leah, belongs to every soul that ever mourned a loss, faced injustice, or watched the innocent endure pain. You may have felt it to watching someone you love struggle with being honest and hardworking, or witnessing a child suffer in a hospital bed. It seems like the world punishes kindness and favors cruelty. So where is God in this chaos? Does he look away? Is he testing us, or is suffering part of a bigger plan we just can't see? The truth is, there are no easy answers. But that doesn't mean there are no answers at all. Life, like a masterfully written book, sometimes hides its meaning until the final pages. The Bible doesn't shy away from stories of suffering, it's filled with them. From Job, who lost everything, to Jesus, who died a brutal death despite living a perfect life. The pattern is undeniable, yet each story offers not despair, but hope. Not random tragedy, but divine purpose. Leah's journey is about to uncover something far deeper than she ever imagined, hidden grace in suffering. At the edge of the cemetery, a gray-haired man approached Leah. His clothes were soaked, but his eyes shone with a strange calmness. He gently said, "Your brother's kindness wasn't wasted. It will echo further than you can see." Leah, surprised, asked, "But why him? He didn't deserve this." The man replied, "Sometimes the brightest candles are taken from this world, so their light can shine where it's needed most. Sometimes suffering is the door to something greater." He handed her a small card. On it was a verse, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Matthew 5-4. Then he disappeared into the rain. Leah couldn't shake the stranger's words. That night, instead of drowning in sorrow, she opened her Bible for the first time in years. She began reading the book of Job. She found not only a man tested to his core, but also the beginning of an answer that suffering might be more than punishment or misfortune. It might be a pathway to transformation. Her tears still came, but now they came with questions that had hope at their center, not just pain. And so, her journey began not just to understand Daniel's death, but to understand life itself. You're not here by accident. If you've ever felt broken, betrayed by fate, or abandoned by God, this story is for you. Leah's story isn't fiction. It mirrors the very real experiences of millions who have faced darkness yet found light. In the chapters to come, we will walk with her as she meets others who've suffered, as she questions faith, and as she slowly discovers something miraculous, that even in suffering, we are not alone. That pain may hurt, but it can also shape us into people of greater love, courage, and joy. So stay with us, because your story, like Leah's, is not over yet. Like plus subscribe if you believe that every soul deserves hope even in suffering. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever asked, why does God let good people suffer? The next morning, Leah sat by her window with a hot cup of tea and opened her Bible again. The sound of rain had stopped, but the silence still echoed in her home. She turned to the book of Job, the story of a man who had everything and then lost it all. Wealth, family, health, peace all stripped away. Yet, despite the devastation, Job never cursed God. He questioned, he cried, he even despaired. But deep inside, he clung to something Leah was now trying to find. Faith that suffering was not the end of a story. Job's story felt deeply personal to Leah. She could relate to his questions. Why was I born at all? What is the purpose of my pain? But what surprised her was how God responded. Not with anger, not with answers. God didn't explain the why, but he reminded Job of the vastness of his creation and the depth of his wisdom. It was as if he was saying, you won't always understand, but I'm still here. And that thought shook something awake in Leah's heart. Maybe God was closer in her suffering than she realized. Many of us see suffering as a wall between us and God, a punishment or a failure of faith. But Leah was beginning to see it differently. Suffering, she realized, could be a bridge, a place where God meets us most intimately. She thought of the stranger's words at the funeral. The brightest candles are taken from this world, so their light can shine where it's needed most. Maybe Daniel's light hadn't gone out, it had just moved beyond what she could see. That afternoon, Leah visited her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, a retired schoolteacher who had battled cancer 3 times and lost her husband a decade ago. Leah asked her, "Do you ever wonder why God lets good people suffer?" Mrs. Patel smiled gently. "Oh, I used to ask that every day. But eventually, I stopped asking why and started asking what. What can I learn from this pain? What can I become through it?" That's when everything changed. Her eyes sparkled with wisdom carved from sorrow. God didn't cause my pain, but he never wasted a moment of it. Leah wrote in her journal that night, "What if the question isn't why, but who? Who do I become in this suffering? Who walks with me through it? Who benefits from the strength I gain here? For the first time, she wasn't trying to escape her grief. She was trying to understand it. Job never got a tidy explanation for his suffering, but he got something far greater, a deeper relationship with God. Leah felt the beginning of that same pull, went to something deeper, something more real. Suffering will come. That is part of being human. But whether it breaks us or builds us often depends on how we choose to face it. Leah was beginning to learn that the most powerful transformation often happens in our lowest moments. Broken things, after all, let light shine through. Her grief wasn't gone, but it was no longer empty. It was becoming sacred. And as her story unfolded, she would discover more people, more moments, and more divine whispers that would turn her pain into purpose and her loss into light. The following Sunday, Leah found herself walking into a small church she hadn't visited in years. The wooden pews, soft hymns, and gentle rustling of pages created an atmosphere of peace she didn't expect. She sat in the back, alone, unsure of what she was seeking, but open to finding something. The pastor stepped up and read aloud, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Galatians 6:2. Leah felt a lump rise in her throat. Her burden felt too heavy to carry. But something about that verse whispered, "You're not supposed to carry it alone." After the service, an older woman named Martha approached Leah. She had seen Leah quietly crying during the closing hymn and gently offered a hand. "I lost my son 2 years ago," Martha said. "The pain never goes away, but somehow it changes shape. Sometimes you carry it. Sometimes others carry you." Leah felt her walls crack. She had been trying to stay strong, to endure quietly. But in Martha's presence, she realized something powerful. Shared pain is lessened pain. The more we isolate, the more it crushes us. But when we open our hearts to others, healing begins. Later that evening, Leah reflected on the stories she had heard that day. A man in the congregation had lost his business and nearly his home, yet spoke of how God used that time to reconnect him with his family. Another woman had survived a violent relationship and now led support groups for others. Leah began to see a common thread. These people had suffered greatly, yet somehow came out with more light in them, not less. Their strength didn't come from pretending everything was okay, but from being real, vulnerable, and supported. Leah couldn't stop thinking about a line the pastor had said during the sermon. Jesus didn't avoid suffering. He entered it. And he still does through us. She looked it up when she got home and read one of the shortest and most powerful verses in the Bible. Jesus wept. John 11:35. that moment, Jesus stood at the grave of his friend, Lazarus, fully divine, yet deeply human. Leah found unexpected comfort in knowing that God doesn't stand above pain with indifference. He enters into it, cries with us, and walks through it by our side. It became clearer to Leah that suffering, while brutal, could be a thread that stitched people together in profound ways. Compassion grows from those who've hurt deeply. Patience blossoms in those who've endured. Faith isn't born on mountaintops, seeds forged in valleys. And sometimes the very people who've been crushed the hardest become the ones who lift others the highest. Leah began to see her grief not as a wall between her and the world, but as a doorway into deeper purpose, connection, and even love. Leah didn't have all the answers. She still missed Daniel terribly, but something inside her had shifted. Her heart, once heavy with hopelessness, was now opening like a flower reaching for sunlight. Maybe suffering doesn't mean God has abandoned us. Maybe it's where we find Him most clearly, through others, through service, through becoming more deeply human. Leah decided to start volunteering at the church's grief group. She wasn't healed yet, but maybe she could walk with someone else who was hurting and find healing in the process. The following week, Leah returned to the church, not just to sit quietly in the back, but to volunteer. The grief support group met every Wednesday night in a small room behind the sanctuary. At first, she felt like an outsider. What could I possibly offer when I'm still broken? She wondered. But the group leader, a warm-hearted man named Carlos, welcomed her with no expectations. You don't need to be whole to help, he said. You just need to show up with your story, your scars, and your heart. And so, Leah stayed. In that circle of tear-streaked faces and raw stories, Leah began to discover a quiet superpower listening. One young woman had lost her husband to cancer after only 2 years of marriage. A father shared about the guilt he carried after his son's accident. Each story carved its own canyon of grief. But by simply being present, by nodding, holding hands, and offering space, Leah felt something shift inside her. In helping others speak their pain, she was slowly healing her own. It wasn't about having answers. It was about being willing to sit in the questions together. One evening, Leah stayed behind to help clean up. Carlos sat beside her and shared something she hadn't expected. I lost my daughter 10 years ago. That's why I started this group. Leah's eyes widened. But you always seem so full of peace. He smiled, a little sadly. Peace doesn't mean the pain is gone. It means I've learned to carry it differently. And somehow, by helping others carry theirs, mine gets lighter too. In that moment, Leah finally understood. Suffering doesn't have to make us bitter, can make us better. If we let it, pain can unlock extraordinary compassion. The next day, Leah visited an elderly neighbor she hadn't spoken to in months. They shared tea, laughter, and tears. Leah didn't try to offer advice. She simply gave herself. And that small act, so simple, so human, began a ripple. Over the following weeks, Leah cooked for a single mother, helped a boy in the neighborhood with his homework, and organized donations for a local shelter. She didn't do these things to numb her grief. She did them because her grief had opened her eyes. The world was full of people silently suffering, and she was no longer blind to it. Leah began writing against something she hadn't done in years. In a small journal, she recorded the names of people she met, the lessons she learned, and the emotions that still ambushed her without warning. And slowly, a realization bloomed. Her suffering was no longer just a wound, was becoming a mission. She wasn't trying to escape it anymore. She was using it to build bridges, to offer comfort, and to reflect the same compassion God had shown her through people, through scripture, and through presence. Her life wasn't what she'd planned, but maybe it was becoming something deeper. Sometimes, Leah still asked why Daniel had to die. That ache hadn't left her, but now, when she asked, her voice was gentler. It was less about demanding answers and more about honoring the mystery. Maybe Daniel's life, his kindness, his last act of service was a seed. And maybe, in Leah's grief, that seed was starting to grow. She was becoming more alive, more loving, more brave. And slowly, she began to see what suffering could do, not destroy, but transform. Not silence, but shape. Not end life's meaning, but deepen it beyond measure. Despite the healing she was beginning to experience, Leah had moments when the grief came roaring back. One evening, she sat on her bed, holding Daniel's old hoodie. The scent had faded, but the memories hadn't. She whispered, "God, I'm doing everything right. I'm serving, praying, even forgiving. But some days, I still feel completely empty. Where are you?" That night, silence answered her prayers. No dreams, no signs, no sudden comfort. Leah stared at the ceiling in the dark and wondered, what if I just convinced myself all of this means something, and it doesn't? Leah didn't speak to anyone about her doubts, not even Carlos or Martha. Part of her felt guilty. She had come so far. She was helping others. Shouldn't her faith be stronger now? But instead, she felt like she was unraveling again. It is feeling many people know, but few admit. That moments of spiritual strength are often followed by deep, personal storms. Doubt, she realized, doesn't always come when we are weakest. Sometimes it comes right after we believe we've been made strong. But perhaps that's when our faith is tested and made real. Unable to sleep, Leah opened her Bible and found herself in the book of Psalms. Her eyes fell on Psalm 13. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? The words startled her. They felt like her own. Written by King David, called a man after God's own heart. They were raw, unfiltered, and painfully honest. Leah's shoulders shook as tears fell, not because she was ashamed, but because she realized something profound. God had made space in His Word for doubt. And not just any doubt, holy, human, honest doubt. In the days that followed, Leah didn't stop doubting, but she stopped hiding it. During the next grief support group, she shared what she had been feeling. Some days, she said softly, "I wonder if God really hears us, or if we're just talking into the dark." To her surprise, no one corrected her. In fact, several people nodded. Carlos leaned forward and said, "Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's trusting enough to keep walking, even when the way is unclear." Leah felt something lift. Maybe faith didn't have to be perfect. Maybe it just had to persist. That Sunday, the pastor spoke on the story of Lazarus. Leah had heard it before Jesus, raising his friend from the dead. But this time, she noticed something new. Jesus wept before he raised him. Even knowing the miracle was coming, Jesus entered the pain of those who mourned. He didn't rush them. He felt with them. And then, at the right time, not their time, he called life from the grave. Leah whispered to herself, "He's the God of slow miracles." Maybe she wasn't being ignored. Maybe she was just in the waiting. And maybe God was grieving with her all along. Leah still had questions. But she also had peace, not the peace that erases suffering, but the peace that stays with you through it. Her faith wasn't as loud now. It didn't roar or shine like a spotlight. It flickered like a candle in a storm, but it didn't go out. And somehow, that small flicker felt more real than any certainty she had ever forced. Leah wasn't healed, but she was being held. And as she walked through her fragile faith, she discovered something beautiful, that God's love was never fragile, even when hers was. It had been 6 months since Daniel's funeral, and though Leah had come a long way, she was about to confront a pain she hadn't yet dared to face: forgiveness. One evening, as she looked through the box of Daniel's belongings, she found the police report. Her hands trembled. The man who had hit Daniel's car, Charles Monroe, was driving under the influence. He survived. Daniel didn't. Leah stared at the name. Her heartbeat quickened. For the first time, her grief transformed into something darker. Not sadness, not emptiness, but rage. Anger, she realized, had been simmering beneath the surface all along. Leah had buried it beneath volunteering, faith, and kindness. But it was still there. She thought, How could God let that man live? Why didn't he stop him? Why did Daniel pay for someone else's mistake? These weren't just questions. Leah wanted justice. She wanted justice. She wanted someone to answer for the pain that had shattered her world. But beneath her anger, another truth stirred. Holding on to blame wasn't bringing her peace, it was blocking it. Leah brought it up with Carlos after group one night. "How do you forgive someone who doesn't deserve it?" she asked. Carlos nodded slowly. "You don't forgive because they deserve it. You forgive because you deserve peace." He paused. Forgiveness isn't saying what happened is okay. It's saying you won't let it control you anymore. Leah blinked. "But I don't feel ready." Carlos smiled gently. Forgiveness rarely feels like freedom at first. It feels like dying. But what dies is your bitterness. And from that burial, healing can grow. That night, Leah lay awake, thinking about the crucifixion. She pictured Jesus hanging on the cross, unjustly accused, beaten, humiliated. In his final moments, he said something unimaginable. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Leah realized that Jesus didn't wait for an apology. He didn't wait for remorse. He forgave from the center of pain. Not because they deserved it, but because love chose it. Leah felt something crack inside her knot, because she was ready to forgive Charles Monroe. But because she knew she couldn't stay trapped in hate much longer. The next morning, Leah sat down and wrote a letter to the man who had taken Daniel's life. She didn't send it. She didn't need to. The act of writing was enough. Her hand trembled as she scribbled words she never thought she'd write. "I don't understand what you did, but I won't spend the rest of my life wishing pain upon you. I release this burden, not for you, but for my brother, for myself, for God. I choose peace." When she finished, she cried, not in anger, but in deep, soul-cleansing relief. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain. It didn't justify the loss. But it lifted Leah. It allowed her to remember Daniel without the shadow of hatred. It allowed her to walk forward without dragging chains behind her. Most importantly, it reconnected her with God, not as a judge, but as a healer. Leah learned that forgiveness is one of the most courageous acts of faith. It's not forgetting. It's choosing not to let the wound define you. And in that choice, Leah discovered something extraordinary. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form. As autumn rolled in and the leaves turned golden, Leah noticed something different in herself. Her grief wasn't gone, but it had settled into a quiet place inside her, a scar, not an open wound. She no longer cried every day, but she still missed Daniel with an ache that caught her by surprise at the most random moments, like while folding laundry, or hearing a joke she knew he would have loved. In these small, unremarkable routines, Leah began to notice something powerful. God was still with her even in the ordinary. One morning, Leah sat at a cafe, watching sunlight pour through the window. A little girl nearby giggled as her dad made silly faces with whipped cream. The sound filled the room with warmth. Leah smiled, and for a moment her heart felt light. It wasn't a miracle, not in the traditional sense, but it felt holy. That afternoon, she helped her neighbor plant flowers and felt joy in the soil between her fingers. Again, not extraordinary, but sacred. It was as if, slowly, Leah was learning to see God, not just in answers, but in presence. One evening, she joined a meditation group at church focused on stillness and awareness. The instructor read Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Leah closed her eyes and simply breathed. She didn't need to ask anything from God. She just wanted to be with Him. And in that silence, she felt at peace, not loud or dramatic, but soft and steady, like a river beneath her feet. God wasn't gone. He was just quieter than she had expected. And sometimes that quiet was exactly what her soul needed. One night, Leah visited Martha, who was now in hospice care. The room was dim, filled with flowers and prayer cards. Martha's voice was weak but cheerful. You look stronger, she whispered, smiled, though tears welled in her eyes. I think I'm finally starting to breathe again. They didn't talk much. They just sat together, hand in hand. When Leah left, she realized something profound. Sometimes, the most spiritual thing you can offer someone is simply your presence. No sermon, no solution, just being there. Leah had once thought miracles meant something dramatically, someone being raised from the dead, or a voice from the sky. But now she realized that miracles also looked like forgiveness blooming in a bitter heart, like grief softening into compassion, like laughter returning after loss. These were the miracles happening quietly, right in front of her. She didn't need thunder from heaven to know God was real. She saw Him in a smile, in a shared story, in the strength to wake up and try again. Leah began writing a blog called The Gentle Light a Place, where she shared her journey through suffering, faith, forgiveness, and small, sacred moments. People from all over the world started reading. Some wrote to say thank you. Others to say they, too, had lost someone. Leah didn't have all the answers, but she had honesty. And that honesty shined brighter than certainty ever could. Her life hadn't gone the way she planned, but it was now filled with grace, purpose, and a quiet kind of joy. She had found God not in the thunder, but in the whisper. Leah sat at her desk one evening, finishing a blog post for the Gentle Light, when she received an email from a local high school counselor. The subject line read, "Would you consider speaking to our grief group?" The message inside shared that several students had recently experienced loss. One had lost a sibling, another a parent. The counselor had read Leah's blog and believed her voice could help these kids find hope. Leah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Was she really ready to speak her pain out loud, not just write it? The day of the talk arrived, and Leah stood in front of a group of 15 teenagers in a quiet classroom. Her palms were sweaty, but she reminded herself, "I'm not here to be perfect. I'm here to be real." She began by telling Daniel's story, not the polished version, but the raw one. She spoke about the anger, the sleepless nights, the questioning of God. She watched their faces soften as they saw themselves in her honesty. And then she spoke about the turning point, the small acts of healing, the grief support group, and learning that it's okay to not be okay. After her talk, a boy in the back raised his hand. His voice cracked as he said, "I thought I was supposed to move on." Leah walked closer and gently replied, "What if you're not stuck? What if you're just grieving in? That's not something to rush through." Another girl asked, "Did God bring this pain into your life on purpose?" Leah paused. "I don't believe God causes pain just to teach us lessons, but I do believe He never wastes it. If we give it to Him, even our broken pieces can become something beautiful." That day marked a shift for Leah. She didn't just want to survive anymore, she wanted to serve. Over the next few weeks, she spoke at churches, community centers, and even prisons. Everywhere she went, she met people who were quietly suffering and felt invisible. She didn't have perfect words, but she brought presence, honesty, and faith that whispered, "You're not alone, and your pain has meaning." It wasn't always easy. She sometimes cried after each talk, but every tear reminded her she was alive, and every conversation reminded her why she kept going. Leah began to realize something sacred. Her wounds hadn't disqualified her from purpose, they had qualified her. People didn't connect to her because she was strong. They connected because she had once been weak and didn't hide it. Through her story, Leah was giving others permission to tell their own. And in doing so, she saw a quiet revolution unfold one heart at a time. Her pain wasn't just hers anymore. It had become a light for others. One afternoon, she received a handwritten letter from a teenage girl named Alina, who had heard her speak. "I was planning to give up. Then I heard your story." Leah clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed. This was why she had walked through the fire and survived. Not just to live again, but to help others rise. Her suffering had become a seed, and from it, purpose had bloomed. Not in spite of the pain, but because of it. Months after she began speaking publicly. The return address said Monroe Correctional Facility. Her heart dropped. It was from Charles Monroe, the man who had taken Daniel's life. Hands trembling, she opened the envelope. The letter was simple, handwritten in uneven script. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read. "I just needed you to know how sorry I am. I think about your brother every day. I think about you. I pray I can someday make peace with what I've done." Leah sat frozen. She hadn't expected this. And yet something cracked open. Anger, confusion, grief, compassion collided inside her like a storm. This man, whom she had tried so hard to forget, had taken something irreplaceable from her. But now he was reaching out not for pity, not for escape, but for a moment of shared humanity. And in that moment, Leah realized how far she had come. A year ago, this letter would have destroyed her. Now, it stirred a new kind of ache, not the ache of bitterness, but of humanness. What if grace wasn't just about letting go, was about letting God reach the places too painful to touch alone? That Sunday, Leah sat by her window as golden light spilled across the floor. She remembered a line she once read. "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Her life had cracked wide open after Daniel died. And through that fracture, grief had poured in, but so had grace. She whispered aloud, "God, I don't know if I'm ready to forgive him, but I want to. Please work through me." It was an honest prayer, not perfect, not polished, but honest. And in that honesty, something sacred stirred. 2 weeks later, Leah visited Monroe Correctional Facility. She had written back, and he had replied. And through that exchange, something unexpected had formed a bridge between two broken hearts. In the chapel, Charles sat nervously, his eyes red. When he saw her, he stood slowly and said, "I don't have any right to ask for your time, but thank you for coming." Leah nodded, silent. Then she said the words that had taken her a year to understand. "You took something from me, and I'll never get it back. But I believe God's mercy is bigger than what we deserve. And if He's still working in you, then so will I." They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just sat people who would forever be connected by pain, but also by the possibility of redemption. Leah left the prison that day with a strange sense of peace, not because anything had been undone, but because something new had been born. Pain doesn't always go away, but it can transform. And from that transformation, we see the miracle that God can use the darkest moments of our lives to create the clearest windows to His light. That night, Leah wrote in her journal, "Redemption is real, not because we earn it, but because God gives it freely. Even to those who failed, even to those who've fallen, even to me. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer asking why good people suffer. She was asking how that suffering could be used to bring good into the world. And in that shift from questioning to becoming, her story stepped fully into its purpose. Leah had returned from the prison with a strange stillness in her spirit, not a perfect peace, but a quiet that comes after a long night of weeping. Life resumed its rhythm: morning coffees, long walks, journaling, teaching at church, and counseling others through grief. Yet deep inside, something had changed. She no longer woke up haunted by the why. She woke with a growing sense of what now. Her pain had not only reshaped her, it was calling her. Something bigger was stirring. One evening, as she drove home from a late Bible study group, she turned on the radio to a Christian talk show. A woman was sharing her testimony about losing her child in a car crash, how that pain led her to start a grief retreat from mothers. "I didn't want that story," the woman said, her voice cracking. "But God used it. He turned my ashes into empathy. My grief became my ministry." Leah pulled over and cried. God was giving her a new assignment. That night, Leah opened a new notebook and wrote at the top of the page, "Hope after loss ministry." She didn't know what it would look like, whether it would be a blog, a podcast, a retreat, or simply a weekly gathering. But she knew it had to exist. People were suffering in silence, just like she had. And someone needed to tell them, "You are not alone. God is still here. Your story isn't over." Her fingers trembled, but her heart burned with purpose. This was no longer about Daniel. This was about every soul crying out in the dark. Within weeks, Leah gathered a small group of grieving individuals at her church. There was Rosa, who lost her teenage daughter to cancer. Brian, a veteran who had lost his best friend in combat. Anna, who had gone through 3 miscarriages. They cried. They prayed. They sat in silence. But slowly, they healed together. What made the space holy wasn't solutions, but presence. Leah didn't offer answers. She offered her story, her empathy, and her faith, and that was enough. Sometimes God doesn't send a rescue. He sends people, and through people, He whispers, "I see you. Keep going." As the group grew, Leah felt another urge bubbling up to share publicly again, not just in churches, but online. She filmed a short video titled, "Why God Allows Pain and How It Can Save Us." It went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in. People from around the world resonated with her journey. "This is the first time I felt understood," one woman wrote. "I thought God had abandoned me. Now, I think maybe He's trying to reach me through my hurt." Leah realized that the more transparent she was about her suffering, the more others found their voice through hers. Months passed, and Leah's ministry bloomed. She spoke at women's conferences, grief retreats, and even schools. She co-authored a devotional titled Grace in the Ashes, filled with stories from real people who turned pain into purpose. And yet, she remained grounded. She never stopped lighting a candle for Daniel on his birthday or crying when she heard his favorite song. But the difference now was this: her grief no longer controlled her hit, served her calling. And in that truth, she discovered the deepest kind of healing, the kind that overflows into the healing of others. When the invitation arrived, Leah stared at it for a long time. It was for a memorial service held by the mother of a boy who had recently taken his own life. They had heard about her ministry and asked her to speak. Leah's first instinct was to say no. What could she possibly say to comfort a grieving mother whose pain was so raw, so recent? But then she remembered a truth she had come to live by. When you've walked through fire, God often sends you back to carry others out. So, with trembling hands, she accepted. The day of the memorial, Leah stood before a crowd of broken-hearted strangers. She had no clever message or perfect scripture. All she had was her story and her scars. "I lost my son," she began, her voice steady. "I asked God why, and I didn't hear an answer for a long time." She shared her tears, her doubts, her anger, how those emotions became the raw materials of something sacred. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the service, people lined up to hug her, to thank her, to share their stories. A teenage boy whispered, "You made me feel like I can keep going." A father admitted, "I was angry at God, but now, maybe I just need to sit with him a while." Leah realized that night that her pain was no longer just a personal wound, was a witness. Her suffering, laid bare, gave others permission to hope. And in that ripple effect, she saw God's quiet, redemptive hand weaving tragedy into testimony. In the following weeks, Leah wrestled with an idea that both humbled and terrified her. Maybe God chooses the broken ones for the greatest tasks, not because they are stronger, but because they are softer, more open, more willing to listen. She thought of Moses with his stutter, Paul with his thorn, even Jesus who wept and bled and suffered like us. Maybe suffering doesn't disqualify us. Maybe it qualifies us. Because pain cracks open the heart hand. That's where compassion lives. Leah began to understand that God doesn't waste suffering. He transforms it. Leah started a weekly podcast called Beauty from the Burnt Places. Each episode featured someone who had been through deep suffering and found purpose on the other side. Cancer survivors, abuse victims, widows, recovering addicts, war refugees. Every story different, yet connected by a golden thread. God did not leave them in the dark. These were not just survivors, they were reborn, not despite their pain, but through it. Leah realized that the people most full of light were often the ones who had been through the deepest shadows. One night, as she walked through the quiet garden behind her house, Leah whispered a prayer. God, thank you for not letting my suffering be meaningless. She wasn't thanking him for the pain, but she was thanking him in it, for how it opened her eyes, softened her heart, deepened her faith. There was a strange kind of joy growing where sorrow once reigned not, a happy-go-lucky feeling, but a soul-deep gladness that she had something to give the world that couldn't be bought or learned, only lived. She was not just a survivor. She was a servant of grace. Leah found herself asking a different question now. It wasn't, why did God let me suffer? But rather, what is God doing through it? The pain had not disappeared, but something had shifted, like her soul had stepped into a new atmosphere. The ground still shook at times, but she no longer feared the tremors. She began to see her life not as a broken thing needing to be fixed, but as a sacred vessel being reshaped. And the potter god was still at work, even in the places she thought were long abandoned. She began receiving letters from people across the country who listened to her podcast or heard her speak. One woman wrote, "I was ready to end my life, but your words kept me one more day. Now I'm healing." A father wrote, "Your story helped me forgive God and myself." Leah wept as she read those messages. It was humbling to realize that her worst nightmare had become someone else's miracle. That the very valley she once cursed had become a place where others met God face to face. Could it be that suffering is sacred ground? Leah started volunteering at a local grief support center. She sat with people in silence. She cried with them. She prayed when words felt too small. Sometimes we are not called to offer answers, but presence. To be the calm in someone else's storm. To hold their shaking hands and whisper, "You're not alone. I'm still here. God is too." In doing this, Leah discovered the hidden gold of compassion. It doesn't erase pain, but it softens the edges and helps carry the weight. As the months passed, Leah became more sensitive to the stories others carried. She saw that everyone was hiding something, a silent ache, a buried loss, an unanswered prayer. And she noticed something else. The most peaceful people weren't the ones with easy lives, but the ones who had suffered deeply and still chose to love. Suffering had stripped them of illusions and pride, and left behind only what mattered: kindness, humility, gratitude. It was in these storm-shaped souls that she saw the reflection of Jesus, who himself was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. One night during a support group, a young woman asked Leah, "Will I ever stop feeling this?" Leah didn't lie. Some wounds never close completely, but I believe God can turn them into holy scars. She touched her own heart and smiled gently. Even Jesus rose from the dead with his scars still visible. That truth echoed in the room like a sacred bell. Perhaps our healing isn't meant to erase the evidence of pain, that testify that we lived, we hurt, we endured, and we were held by God through it all. Leah stood by the window one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. The sky blazed with fire and soft gold. She remembered all the nights she thought she'd never see another dawn. Yet here she was, live, purposeful, loved. Not in spite of her suffering, but because of what it had taught her. She had discovered the gift within the grief: empathy, wisdom, resilience, and above all, hope. And in that sunrise, she heard the quiet whisper of God again. You are not forgotten. You are chosen. You are rising. She smiled. The story wasn't over yet.